Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of Poetry Worth Hearing, hosted by me, Kathleen McPhillamy, and with music by Alex Heen. In this episode, which has the theme of after, or influence, we hear Cahal Dallat talking about the importance of W.B. Yeats and reading some of his own poetry. Then we have a range of poems from Lyn Thornton, Helen Overell, Matt Bryden, Trisha Broomfield, Stephen Paul Wren, Diana Bell, Heather Moulson, Simon Rees, and Dinah Livingstone. Cahal Dallat was born in Ballycastle, County Antrim, and he is the founder-organiser of the W.B. Yeats Bedford Park Artwork Project. His own most recent collection, Beautiful Lofty Things, note the tongue-in-cheek Yeatsian title, was published by Salmon Press in 2022. You can find out more about him and his work, and about all our other poets, on poetryworthhearing.biz.
I have to admit that in choosing the title, Beautiful Lofty Things, for my latest collection from Salmon Poetry, I was influenced by W.B. Yeats, who published, just before he died at the age of 73, a poem called Beautiful Lofty Things. Yeats's Beautiful Lofty Things is very much about people doing, well, beautiful lofty things. His father denouncing the reactionary Philistine protesters, and Ireland generally, from the Abbey Theatre stage. Augusta Gregory, Yeats's Abbey Theatre co-founder, seated at her ormolu table by the window of her country house, Cool Park, unafraid of threats from the local rebels. And the great unrequited love of his life, Maud Gonne, just being Maud Gonne, or rather just being a goddess, which to Yeats was much the same thing. So my title poem isn't so much an after as an opposite, in that it's about unimpressive things that you'd find in the loft, or attic, or a garden shed, or at the back of a desk drawer, and finding them beautiful, or at least a fit subject for poetry, thus all very un-Yeatsian. But I'll come back to my own poetry with a little randomly chosen quartet from the book at the end, before which I want to talk about Yeats as an influencer. Who isn't influenced by Yeats, of course? T.S. Eliot said Yeats was the greatest poet writing in the English language, and, so far as Eliot was able to judge, in any language. So he certainly influenced all poetry after Yeats, as it were, as he's a kind of crossways, the title of one of his collections, an intersection between Wordsworth's lyrical ballads and Eliot's modernism, and, as Yeats put it, the sort now growing up all out of shape from toe to top, where, in homage to William Morris's ideas on poetry and arts and crafts, Yeats had actually insisted that we, as poets, should learn our trade and sing whatever is well made. So I want to talk about Yeats as an influencer, but also about the influences on Yeats. And interestingly, I've always believed that one of the greatest influences on a poet is place. We're all aware of the impact of the Lake District on Wordsworth and Gloucestershire on the Dimmock poets, and much of my arts advocacy over the years has been around the poetry and politics of Belfast poet John Hewitt, whose views on life and the differing traditions in the north of Ireland had its Damascus moment in dramatic scenery and rural community of the Antrim Glens, my home, and an area of outstanding natural beauty. So much so that Hewitt's writing went on to inspire Seamus Heaney, a poet to whom his home place meant so much, and the next generation, Maeve McGuckian, who writes about my hometown of Ballycastle, and Kieran Carson, the chronicler of Belfast's street map, and Paul Muldoon from Armagh. So that poet and place obsession has led me to residencies in Carmel, California, from where leading US poet of the 1920s, Robinson Jeffers, searching for an even more dramatic coastline than Big Sur and Point Lobos, came to live in the Antrim Glens. So you might expect me to talk about how the wild and dramatic west of Ireland landscape influenced Yeats, much as, say, Tintern Abbey influenced Wordsworth. The interest in Yeats that has absorbed most of my time for the past 10 years is the story of how one particular and unlikely place, Bedford Park, where I live in West London, and where the Yeatses lived 100 years prior, became the crucible that transmuted a young Irish schoolboy's love of Irish landscape, legends and lore into Nobel Prize gold, and nurtured one of the outstanding literary careers of the 20th century. Worth noting when we talk about poetry and place that Yeats, the only poet raised in England and writing in English to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, is Irish, as is the one other Nobel Prize winning poet born in the United Kingdom, Seamus Heaney. The story of that crucible, beginning with Yeats's father's decision to abandon a career in law after he finished at Trinity College Dublin, and take his family to London, where he started again, as it were, by going to art college, has so many implications for the neighbourhood here. How migrant families, Irish, German, Ukrainian, Indian, were welcomed and celebrated here in the 1880s. How, despite what we think of as industrial, military, colonial, Christian, Victorian Britain, there was a community here that was liberal, egalitarian, progressive, feminist, mostly vegetarian, spiritually seeking, anti-imperial, communal, if not actually communard or communist. And most importantly, for future creativity and for society in general, how a supportive community of artists fosters creativity, produces other artists, how poets need the company of poets and thinkers and creators, how, with my workshop advocate's hat on now, every poet, including Yeats, learns their trade by sharing with fellow poets and critiquing each other's work in progress. But to begin at the beginning, I didn't discover Yeats when I came to London from the Antrim Blends. My maternal grandfather, like Yeats's, came from Sligo and would frequently recite the Lake Isle of Innisfree, or Had I the Heavens Embroidered Cloths, or, when thinking politically, recite Easter 1916 with its litany of heroes and the terrible beauty of the uprising. And when he was old, reciting When You Are Old. So Sligo was somewhere we'd visit on family holidays. My mother was named Constance after Constance Gore Booth, one of the Gore Booths of Lissadell, a painter and a great friend of Yeats's. Constance married Ukrainian artist Kazimir Markovich and played a leading part in the Easter Rising. And so we visited Lissadell, as I did later on a school trip, that visit becoming the subject of one of my first poems entitled Final Movement, which was republished recently in John Greening's anthology Hollow Palaces, about great country houses, where it was published, in fact, alongside a Wendy Cope Villanelle, Lissadell. But that was later, when I became a poet, if one ever becomes a poet, or perhaps one always was a poet. Certainly at Queen's in Belfast, surrounded by Paul and Maeve and Kieran, with Seamus turning up at poetry readings in the Union, one felt that one was a poet. And when I went to Paris at the end of second year with Anne-Marie, then my girlfriend, and to whom I'm now married, I was scribbling furiously. And when we came back via London, we stopped off at Turnham Green for dinner with friends, one of whom was, entirely coincidentally, a cousin of Major John McBride, soldier, rebel and martyr, and Yeats's great love rival, who had succeeded where Yeats had failed in winning the hand of Maud Gonne, the woman whose visit to Yeats at his family home in Bedford Park, a few hundred yards from where I am just now, so affected Yeats that he identified it as the day the troubling of my life began. One might also say it was the day that his career as the ultimate poet of unrequited love began. And as Maud, the daughter of a British Army major, was much more political and a good deal more dramatic than young Willie, the day the troubling of his political views began too, leading to a cultural revival that was to be the soft diplomacy that would eventually allow Ireland to take her place among the nations, with, in fact, W.B. Yeats as one of its first senators. But for now, it's simply the two of us coming out of Turnham Green Tube Station with our duffel bags to see a beautiful Dutch-style red brick and white picket fence village stretching off into the sunset, to which my immediate reaction, although there were no signs to say so back then, was, but this is Bedford Park, this is where the Yeatses lived, this is where Willie wrote the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and on and on. All of which I knew because of Sister Vincentia, who had taught me A-level English in Ballycastle and who had been to one of the first Yeats summer schools in Sligo in the 1950s. And so we were late for dinner in Bedford Park as we spent the next hour exploring its winding tree-lined avenues and the Church of St. Michael and All Angels with its William Morris-style stained glass windows of angels with flaming hair playing lutes. And you suddenly understood how Yeats's poem, The Travail of Passion, began with the line, "The flaming, lute-thronged angelic door thrown wide." And so many of the houses back then had artist studios attached with paintings and easels and draperies, and some had minstrels' galleries, and some with pianos and cellos, and walls lined with lutes and mandolins and viols and djembas and harps and psalteries, and hung, of course, with heaven's embroidered cloths. Now, this was 80 years after the Yeatses, but one still felt, how could Willie not have become a poet in this atmosphere? But it obviously wasn't the case that Yeats automatically became a poet simply by living in this aesthete artist colony. And I had no illusions that moving here would make me a great Yeatsian poet, any more than, say, sharing a birthday with Gustav Holst or Leonard Cohen would make me a great composer or songwriter. But we did move here, and gradually, while writing my own poetry and writing about other poets and places, and doing literary journalism for the TLS and Guardian and BBC's Kaleidoscope and Nightwaves and Saturday Review, came to understand more and more of the Yeats story, to the extent that I started giving talks, seminars and lectures, not simply on Yeats, there are far too many academics doing that around the world, but on how this cluster of a couple of hundred Queen Anne-style houses and the aesthetic and eccentric residents, actors, artists, anti-colonialists, engravers, illustrators, architects, editors, anarchists, activists. They don't all have to start with a vowel, of course. There were also small press publishers and transcendentalists and theosophists, how they were all a catalyst to Yeats's genius. So I've talked on Yeats and Politics for the Poetry Society at Somerset House, Yeats and the River for the Chiswick Pier Trust, Yeats's Englishness for the Irish Embassy in London, and Yeats's Irishness for the Irish Embassy in Washington, and about Yeats and William and May Morris on Arts and Crafts for Kelmscott House, and simply about Yeats's boyhood London neighbourhood at universities and colleges and festivals and conferences and summer schools here and in Ireland and across the US from Savannah to Seattle. And I started running regular Yeats Bedford Park literary walks. Though what always surprised those who came on the walks was when we'd come to the end of the tour and stand on the roadway or on the pavement grey, as Yeats put it, and could hear Yeats's Leg Isle of Innish Free, could hear it in the deep heart's core. There was no sign to say Yeats was here. And so it seemed inevitable that I'd have to have an artwork created to signal Yeats's presence and the importance in the development of England's only Nobel Prize-winning poet of the spirit of Bedford Park. This isn't the place to go into the details, much of which is on the project's website, of the years of fundraising and planning permission and events and lectures and readings, or indeed to try to describe Conrad Shawcross's stunning artwork that symbolises Yeats's genius and the spirit of arts and crafts Bedford Park, spiralling up in a Yeatsian gyre of, as Yeats would put it, hammered gold and gold enamelling, or of golden and silver light, like a flurry of autumn leaves, the trees in their autumn beauty, like a flock of Yeats's white birds on the foam of the sea, like a flight of Yeats's angels. This wonderful, dazzling artwork that now marks the entrance to Bedford Park opposite Turnham Green Tube. The full story of Poet and Place is a 2.5-hour walk, though thanks to some lovely editing work and rehearsing with Oscar-nominated National Theatre actor Kieran Hines, who's been a patron and mainstay of the project, we've condensed that, together with some of Yeats's best-loved Bedford Park-era poems, into a QR code-triggered smartphone tour of 10 local spots that give a hint of the influences on Yeats in his Bedford Park years. So if I mention just a few of those, you'll start to see how place influences poet. There's the Bedford Park Club, for example. As the world's first garden suburb, Bedford Park was built not just with houses, but with a pub, a church, a school, a village shop. Of course, it's now technically in London, but was out in the country at the end of the Tube Line in 1875. A sports ground, a school of art, and a social club. The only club in the country that allowed men and women in on an equal footing. And one of the key personalities in the club was Virginian abolitionist Daniel Moncure Conway, a follower of Thoreau and Emerson and Walt Whitman, and was Walt Whitman's London agent. Thoreau, as we know, had been writing about a cabin by the lake, and Yeats had been reading both Whitman and Thoreau, whose principles were very much behind Bedford Park's good life pastoral ideas when he wrote about his cabin on the Lake Isle of Innish Free. But Thoreau and Emerson, as transcendentalists, had written about Buddhism. So Yeats's neighbour Conway went off to Sri Lanka in 1880 to study Theravada Buddhism, and in 1889 he brought the first Western Buddhist convert, Henry Steele Olcott, to lecture in the Bedford Park Club, a lecture which Yeats attended on December the 7th, 1889, which meant for the rest of his spiritual life he was attracted to Eastern teachings, accounting for his friendships and collaborations with Rabindranath Tagore, Manmohan Ghosh, G.K. Cheddar, Sarojini Naidu, and Sri Purohit Swami, with whom 45 years after that evening he sat down to translate the Upanishads, a text sacred to both Hinduism and Buddhism. But the club was also where Yeats first attended local amateur dramatics, mostly staged by the Pagets, a couple who'd both been at art college with Yeats's father and who lived next door to one of Yeats Senior's fellow Trinity College alumni, the Irish poet and dramatist John Todhunter, who wrote The Banshee. And when the Pagets decided to stage one of Todhunter's plays, Henrietta Paget asked her sister, who was a professional actor and George Bernard Shaw's leading lady, to play one of the parts. Yeats heard her perform and was struck by her delivery and went off to create a new form of poetry recital for her with a reinvented medieval psaltery, like the harp that David plays in Bible illustrations. As Leonard Cohen puts it, I've heard there was a secret chord that David played to please the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you? In a sense, Yeats was unmusical and could only hear the music in words. Words alone are certain good, he said, and yet he was passionately interested in chanting and in music and words together in performance. But as well as reciting to the Psaltery, Florence commissioned Yeats to write a play to feature her niece Dorothy Paget as a fairy, and Yeats wrote Land of Heart's Desire, which started his mission to form an Irish literary theatre, which would become the world-famous Abbey Theatre and would inspire People's Theatre worldwide. That's just 2 out of 10 locations. There's the art school where Willie's brother Jack became Ireland's greatest modern painter, the 2 houses where the Yeatses lived at different times, and if I can skip from there to the last location, there's Kelmscott House where he attended French classes, argued about politics with Russian anarchists, and where his sisters learned the skills that would enable them to found Ireland's 20th century craft revolution. One can see that Yeats's life wasn't simply about the craft of poetry, but in his genuine search for unity of being, was about art and theatre, music and politics, religion and the East, but always that idea of creating something beautiful and inspired, not by the beauty of his surroundings when growing up, but by the commitment to art and beauty of all those around him, by a love of high ideals, of beautiful, lofty things. So here endeth, in a way, a short introduction to Yeats and some of the local Bedford Park influences on him, resulting in so many strands of our cultural life today, here and in Ireland and globally, which Yeats influenced. So I'm going to move on to 4 of my own poems, ending with Beautiful Lofty Things. In case anyone thought I have only one favourite poet, Yeats, or perhaps a small number of poets to whom I'm devoting my life, Hewitt and after, say, as in Seamus Heaney, then Miv McGuigan, Kieran Carson, Paul Muldoon, etc., and a select few others, Robinson Jeffers, who has taken me to Carmel in California and the University of Texas in Austin on residencies and fellowships, and Charles Causley, whose poet residence I was in his centenary year of 2017, and so on. I should explain that I run masterclasses, creative and critical, where poets explore and then respond to themes in the work of 6 of my favourite poets in each series. And as I'm now in the 17th series, that means I have avowedly 17 times 6 or 102 or more favourites, at least. But poetry's like that, is it not? And among those favourites, on whom I've talked and lectured and written, are the Russian poets of the Silver Age, Marina Tsvetaeva, Osip Mandelstam, and Anna Akhmatova, whom we were introduced to at Queen's University Belfast in the 70s by Seamus Heaney, who was an amazing reader and advocate and found much in Russia's troubled century to mirror our own situation in Belfast. But a few years before I went up to Queen's, when all I knew of Marina Tsvetaeva was that she'd written a long poem based on Stenka Razin, the hero of the folk song that we know in the 60s in English as, that we knew in the 60s in English as The Carnival is Over. I met some actual Russians on a stormy night when their trawler had taken shelter in our bay on the rugged North Antrim coast. So this story could actually begin: a Russian trawlerman walks into a bar. At the Marina Hotel. We'd lived too long with our unorthodox nuns foretelling, Freedom will come when Muscovy men, skiffings of snow or hail bristling their bare coats, set foot in our estuary, not to feel a frisson, Liam, Kevin and I, on the bar. As a reefer-jacketed crew at the Cold War's height troops into the velour residence lounge. Gumboots off, feet up on plate glass-topped coffee tables, the one with Trotsky lunettes, scanning prices, translating cocktail names to barracking laughs and black cigarettes all round. Toasts. Then one hauls a squeeze box from his duffel, weighs in with the strident fourth that's stinker razzin that we know, Kevin, Liam and me, as the carnival is over. And when it finally is, Kevin's really taken with them. That's not a figure of speech. Kevin is, after a long Vladivar night of the soul, taken with them. Postcard from Stavanger. Spent all souls on atomic neutral beach in Iceland, followed up with detained on Nevsky Prospect for anti-Soviet attitudes outside Cathedral on Spilled Blood. And after, nothing, nada, zilch. While Liam slouches towards another rough beast that will lour over our next 40-odd years. For myself, I buy the one-row squeeze box for a night's bar earnings and find the 17th century nun's prophecy had no snow omens, just Russian galleons hoving into pier with their topsails afire. I'm reading this next piece for Kathleen McPhillamy to say thanks for hosting this series and for having me talk and read. We'd been in touch not so long ago in a case of sort of mistaken identity, as we'd met years earlier, and Kathleen more recently had been researching the early industrial revolution or pre-industrial revolution in my hometown of Ballycastle, and had read a number of articles which I was later able to explain were written by my father, who was Ballycastle's local historian. In fact, although we lived in a rural community growing up, I'd never thought at all that my grandfather and his brother had built a huge wheel for the local coal mine, or that there were quarries dotted around with large-scale industrial equipment rusting in the landscape, until poet Anne-Marie Fife, to whom, as I've said, I'm married, started taking black and white photos of these relics of an industrial age, and I could suddenly see that same lost world that one sees in America's Rust Belt, or in the steel and coal areas in the north of England, where Ted Hughes grew up and where I spent time in the 1980s during the miners' strike. Hence the reference to Mexborough, which, with reference to that strike and the loss of industrial work as the raison d'etre of so many communities in the Midlands and North, I've referred to here as vanquished Mexborough. Pit. Nearer my town than yours, on the downhill stretch when I'd hike the 16 miles home by night, a gravel pit, or maybe sand, derrick and conveyors long oxidized, we'd pass without seeing ourselves, children of a lost industrial era. Your bauxite mining great-grandfather, my short-sleeved grandfather on top of a coal mine's giant pulley wheels in a 1900 and something town museum display. A quarry we'd passed for years, unseeing until after the birthday we bought the Nikon FM and you took black and white roll after roll, watched images emerge through developer, stop bath, fixer in our London cellar until we finally understood it as relic, icon, a page of romanticized history long before we knew of Salgado, the Rust Belt, or the creakings of vanquished Mexborough. What I should have said about these poems is that opposite each in the book is an image of the thing. Those Russian rubles in the case of the Marina Hotel poem, one of Anne-Marie's black and white photos that's on the notice board above my desk, a music box, a tin whistle, my father's Russian spy camera, not that my father was a Russian spy, it's complicated, and several of my abandoned musical instruments, as distinct from mandolin, saxophone, baroque flute, two pianos, four accordions, and a bandoneon, which are in current use. The abandoned instruments include a mando fiddle, balalaika, several flutes, and a very basic soprano saxophone handmade by hill tribesmen in India. I taught systems analysts in India in the 1990s and had much time both to explore religion and culture and to travel in the northern hinterland around Delhi and the Golden Triangle down to Jaipur and Agra. And one of the things I loved about working there was the daily procession of life outside the office window. And in the middle of a lecture, the sudden blaring sound of a marriage band in their splendid pseudo-military uniforms parading past on their way home. a saxophone in amber. Watching the scrappy marriage band in Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali on their long, tuneless way to Tipperary, post-colonially British in its ersatz Irishness. I'm back years in Tech Block C15, New Auckland Industrial Development Area, the daily procession below bomb-proof windows of bicyclists head-carrying entire forests, rickshaw peddlers with a dozen school kids hugging tiffin tins on a rickety plank, near comatose white noonday cows. And afternoons, disbanding marriage bandsmen in white uniforms with gold and scarlet braid unloosed, tubas trombones slung over shoulders, under arms, and the occasional exuberant, shimmering trumpet cadenza, silver instruments, not brass, red keywork, not abandoned by a vanished empire, but new and locally forged. Irresistible then, when I meet a local maker, casting keys and levers in noon-dark archways below Amber Fort, this silver circusy soprano with the wrong mouthpiece. But yes, the red enamelled keys and a tone hovering between alpenhorn and a classic Chennai, braying, perfect for our desafinado post-colonial revelries. So I'm ending with my title poem. Yeats's Beautiful Lofty Things, as I've said, is very much about high-minded, idealistic people. But actual things, found things, disregarded things have increasingly played a part in art, from Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades to Peter Blake's pop art to Beatles songs. And so my lofty things are mostly objects that have ended up in the loft, including a stack of signed copies of my father's book, Rooms of Time. Time is very much a theme in the book. And in this poem, in fact, including clocks that no longer tell the time. There is one Yeats connection here in that he does say in The Four Ages of Man, speaking of man waging war on God, at stroke of midnight God shall win, though in Faust I don't think it's God who wins. Beautiful, lofty things. A Jacob's tin of luggage padlocks, key rings, fuse wire, split pins, wing nut washers, unboxed glockenspiel, stacks of yellow 90s Times of India, a son's guitar and Vox amp, BMX, handlebar pads, Nikon tripod, pharmacist's locked Victorian cabinet, an uncle's bird's eye maple escritoire, another's darkroom reels and drum, full cast list of papier-mâché Punch and Judy heads, ballet pumps, Ponchielli's Dance of the Hours, when you unclick a lacquered jewel box, plus unsold stocks of my father's book on time. And this battered cardboard box of hours, of every clock that ever failed the test of time, the clocks that time forgot, whose winged chariots outran or flew backwards as one did once chillingly, superannuated digitals with plugs cut off, or gnawed away inside, corroded by their flaky single cells, and one that pulses on, its scarlet 12:00 frozen at Gary Cooper's analog high noon, the pumpkin minute, Yeats's stroke of midnight, good Dr. Faust's Mephistophelian hour come round, its still unanswered blink, still shrugging, que sera, sera.
Fascinating talk and some great poems from a beautiful book. More details can be found at poetryworthhearing.biz. And now we move on to some other interpretations of After. Lyn Thornton reads 3 poems reflecting the different impacts of a poet, an artist, and a filmmaker.
Hello, my name's Lyn Thornton, and I have 1 or 2 poems I'd like to read apropos Kathleen's prompt of After, and I suppose I've taken it in terms of what has influenced me. The first one is called Fellini's Roma, seeing the film again after a very long period and realising how brilliant it was. Fellini's Roma. Listen, above the hiss of a steam train, above the thunderous sheeting of rain, above the late-night clatter of trams, above the wailing of car horns on the autostrada, above the barking of dogs, songs of street singers. I am the city you yearned for, the city you think you have found, in the mountains, in the brothels, in the wide piazzas, in the streets, in the ghost life of subterranean frescoes, in the dissolute soldiery, in Caesar's broken statue, in the bird's eye view from your gantry, swooping like an eagle through wind and rain, in the long shots, the close-ups, the granite faces, the butchered animal carcasses sliding across a frame, the Cardinal's Circus, hell by any other name. You think you have caught me, but listen. Above this cacophony, the bewildered faces, carved imagery, you will find only a shapeshifter, a dream you have created, and it has many names. The second poem, An Awkward Bow, is a reference to Keats, and the quote is taken from a letter, Keats' last letter, addressed to Charles Brown in Rome, November the 30th, 1820. An awkward bow. To try and catch your voice seems an impertinence. Instead, I'll stand and listen, block out all traffic noise, and hope to hear its tone on a lifting wind, or summon up the sprite of you, running through the vale of health, or bounding up Holly Hill to watch the sunset reflected in the Whitestone Pond, or over the heath to the Spaniard's Inn, letting your thoughts drift to Naples heat and headiness, a whole 2 years away from you taking an awkward bow, leaving us, as you thought then, only the shadow of your hand reflected on uncertain tides. And finally, a very short poem, and it's a cento called The Space Between, and these are quotes from a Slade lecture given by William Kentridge last term, the South African artist, really polymath and quite brilliant individual. A blank page. Where is the edge? A world reduced to paint, leaves leaning on air. We are collage under construction. We need to remember, we desire to forget. City of gold, panned for, broken fingers brush away dust. We are in the landscape and we are out of it. The old gods have retired. Weigh all tears. My heart is in hiding. There is pleasure in self-deception, the pleasure of becoming another. Let us leap and then look.
Our next poet is Helen Overell, who takes after in its temporal sense.
Approaching retirement. Chest pains niggled her, but she'd work to do. All those troubled teenagers to encourage, mothers to offer hope to, fathers to support. And the gathering mattered, thinking of ways forward, standing alongside, each one offering the best they could. Long days full of meetings. the party well earned. Spanish guitar, castanets, dancing flamenco, despite being more solid oak than willow. And that was when flame took hold. Not one to fuss, not wanting to, she kept going. No one realised. And then sitting down helped, so everything was fine, really, but not. Next day, the locum, unhurried, calm, kind, wrote a letter for her to take to A&E, that place the self-harmers washed up at. Her face fell. She'd spent hours there calming families, offering care, building bridges although time stood still, and so, do I have to? Getting there another story. Instant attention, questions, tests, being stranded flat out on a trolley so high above the ground she dared not move. Angiogram, transfer to London. One cannula, another that somehow broke free, rainbow arc of thinned blood that filled the air, doused floor, blankets, walls, deep and weary peace, no fear whatever, calm. So this is death? Being rescued, cleaned up, meeting the man from Dublin, from back home, whose way of talk, so in keeping with her own, brought comfort, who was of like mind, understood humour, whose angioplasty mended her heart, put right the damage, left nothing but the merest scar, gave her years yet, nothing wrong with her at all after that, life as usual, and yet not the same.
Thank you, Helen. The texts of all these previously unpublished poems can be found at poetryworthhearing.biz. Matt Bryden's 4 poems move between a sense of after as aftermath and a reflection of influences from Homer to Scorsese.
I'm Matt Bryden. I'm going to read 4 poems on the theme of after. Haunts. You have adopted magical thinking, a ring about your neck lifted to your lips and kissed, the chain smoothed of snags and kinks. You gesture to the aspen, the sound of leaves in the wind. In a playground a stone's throw from the bedroom you are living out of, your 3-year-old says she wants to stay the night with you. You nearly fall to your knees. This is the poem which collides my daughter's 2nd birthday lunch with descriptions of Odysseus' home in Ithaca in the Odyssey. Birthday, Shoreditch White. In the cafe where we celebrated your 2nd, you ate an Indian chicken salad and sipped juice as we supported you on a silver-studded chair. There was a silver lintel, a golden handle, and dogs made out of gold and silver on each side, fashioned by Hephaestus. It being morning, the waitress ran a hand down her spine to wake the dragon, stepped from foot to foot as she took your order, white-armed mother holding white-armed daughter. It was the day after my birthday, so hospitality was not as rust. And was it Athena lent as a pink mist, so there was depth to the pile, shade to the plush? We stopped by a fishmonger's, samphire spread on ice, took home a bass for later with butter and pepper, that life might leave us only when we had once more seen our property, our people, our great high-roofed house. Trial. It's like you are dead, and I'm in a house of invalids. Voices come through the walls, scared something will crack. 5 weeks since we've talked, stray cats at the glass. I am bounced out of my senses, kettled in a tennis court. I miss my friend, her smile, as fire doors click shut. Who's to say why I'm not eating or drinking, whether you carry the end of this process inside you? And this poem links two scenes, post and pre-bout, in Martin Scorsese's celebrated 1980 biopic of Jake LaMotta. Boxer. The scene in Raging Bull, tender hands milling the ice, cubes half melted to a solution, his looping knuckles swollen of definition by his landed blows. The camera, now fast, now slowing mid-swoop, casts us back pre-fight as Vicky kisses his bruised stomach and sprawls upon the bed, then walks towards the bathroom door. A jostle of ice cubes as he tips the jug down the front of his shorts.
Now, Trisha Broomfield, with a slightly sardonic look at influences in two quite different poems.
Role models. Oh, Mary Tyler Moore, those legs, always in black, kicking back at the stereotypical housewife, the polo neck sweaters I still choose to wear, and that hair. I loved it all. You were in control, wiping the occasional womanly tear, beating your Dick Van Dyke husband at pool. You moved with such grace, and you had a waist. Your face, when it smiled, lit up the room. Cathy Gale you followed, leather-clad on a black and white screen. You joined John Steed in the fight against evil, appearing self-assured in Series 2, when Steed switched to Savile Row suits. Just as I had decided you were the one, you left in 1964, becoming Pussy Galore. You still fought your corner, but you'd lost out to James Bond. Emma Peel, you were next. You'd steal the show from Steed, despite his suave smile, his bowler hat in seasonal shades. From you, the villains would run a mile, your high-kicking catsuit spinning them across the room, knocking out chairs and china with such ease. And you had a waist. One day a husband returned to claim you, and Steed looked wistful, but not for long. A thief of words. I prized open Hardy's poem, released his strings of broken lyres. Inspired, I lied, owned them, wrote them to you, never to be sent, after the event. I scan my pages and find that scribes of ages have lent me their colour, and when I read, dames, in the best sense, have bequeathed me the flavour of their rounded sound, reminding me that consonants abound, and urging me to finish my words, not swallow the hollow Lincolnshire wolds that underpin my voice. I have a choice, but like a sponge I absorb, my listening ear grabs hungrily at any accent I hear. EastEnders, beating elocution, hands down.
Next, Stephen Paul Wren with a mathematical influence.
Hello, this is Stephen Paul Wren, and I'm going to read a poem that was inspired by meeting the great physicist Roger Penrose during my time at Oxford. Each line begins with a letter of the alphabet in the abecedarian format. So the first line begins with A, second B, and so on, all the way through to Z. And each line has a constraint of 5 syllables. Penrose. A Nobel winner, British brave, running cycles of time, and dove's eyes views on space, events, the start and fate of the cosmos, rips humankind with holes that shine blackness. Invert a matrix, juggle the numbers, knock up a staircase, looping up and down, master for Escher. Notions flow from you, oh Sir Roger. Craft Penrose tilings now, quads, kites, and some darts. Run by constraints. Shapes are all fitted, the tiles with beauty, unlike chaos. Tiles varied by system, welded by command. Xeric lands could be yours to water with zenith-like artwork.
You need to see the poem on the page to appreciate its alphabeticity. A link to the text can be found at poetryworthhearing.biz. In Diana Bell's poem, the after is implicit.
Level 4. Lift going up. Please mind the door. Door closing. Door opening. Here we are, each with our own story, our own pain. Mother and daughter, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, a lone person in a wheelchair. We sit in rows, silently suspended between present and future, sipping water, reading a book, checking mobile phone, drinking coffee. Sunlight slides through blinds and draws white lines on the floor. A name is called like a lottery number. The next person disappears behind a blue curtain. A life changed every hour, every day, while the sandwich trolley goes round and a cleaner mops the floor. Lift going down. Please mind the door. Door closing.
Heather Moulson gives us two not entirely serious accounts of influence.
Under the influence. I can't drive because I'm under the influence of you. The emotional police will stop me. I was warned you may cause drowsiness and to give operation of heavy machinery a wide berth. But you're under my skin and other features. You've crayoned me in a different colour, and I'm aware I'm just another figure on your sketch pad, shaded in for fun, an eraser on standby. Love Anonymous washed their hands of me, written off as a hopeless case. I may have to go as high as the Ministry of Love. According to George Orwell, they're big on influences. Beryl the Peril. Oh, lovely Beryl the Peril, running away from policemen and your slipper-wielding dad, puffing in his permanent striped suit. You always outsmarted Cynthia and her pals, biting my nails that you would run out of adventures, but there you were every Tuesday, freshly drawn with another ruse. I coveted plaits like yours and longed to look that good in a gym slip. Why couldn't you have lived round our way? You would have come home for tea. We'd fire pea shooters and say words like super. Blissfully, you never had sleepovers. I think that would have been too much.
And now Simon Rees with a growing up story in miniature.
Fingernails for Louise. As a boarding school boy, he chewed them to the quick.
and worried at the skin. Always after he bit them neat for grooming or hurt them for solace. In his 50s he found a therapist. Within 2 years he bought nail clippers.
The last poem in this episode comes from Dinah Livingstone.
This poem, called After All, is after, that alludes to, the title poem of A.C. Jacobs' collection, The Proper Blessing. After all. When I wake up, the rain is pouring down from a lowering sky. I am depressed. I cower in bed, don't want to face the day. I force myself to shower, get dressed, not feeling well. Suddenly the sun comes out, and everything has been refreshed, sparkles much more kindly than before. Now, like the clouds, my gloom evaporates, and I am fine again. I realize the rain was right, and was a proper blessing after all.
You can find more about Dinah, as well as the text of her poem and details of Arthur Jacobs' book, at poetryworthhearing.biz. But that's everything for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed listening, and please share the podcast with others you think might enjoy it too.